Thanks for joining us. As I said earlier, we are on our fourth salon. I think today we decided to run a series called Tech in the Time of Coronavirus, just because the whole coronavirus period is so digital and so many organizations are moving to digital responses. And there's just a lot to talk about and think about in terms of what digital means in this particular time. I think more than any other kind of disaster that we've seen. It's also quite interesting that it's affecting everywhere in the world. So organizations that normally provide a response to disasters are now also facing this similar type of situation in their own countries. So that's all kind of made this type of disaster slightly different than what we've seen in the past. We've been running salons for over 10 years. I've been doing the one in New York since 2011. It's always been in person. So we've been kind of experimenting with our partners now, with ThoughtWorks, with GitHub, with Pivotal, VMware, and with Dial, and kind of putting forth these digital salons. So we've got some organizers. This is kind of the original organizing team. What's exciting for me, though, is that we have a bunch of other folks that are starting to join in, and when we're getting additional support from ThoughtWorks, especially to kind of bring some of these things forward. So today we have a transcriber as well. We've got Anita who's transcribing for us, and we have a few other folks from ThoughtWorks that are learning how to do the back end so that they can continue to support as we do these going forward. These are sponsors that, as I said, have been working with us up to now. ThoughtWorks, again, GitHub, Pivotal Act, and Digital Principles at Dial. Our first one was kind of a general, how could the whole tech sector respond to COVID? Then we talked with folks from Uganda and Pakistan as well as Ghana, and Lizzie, who's on the call, facilitated that salon. We're really talking with local organizations about their responses and how they were managing things. Then our last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago, was around data ethics and privacy. And then today, as I mentioned, and as you all know, today is around volunteering your tech skills. And so we've got some really great speakers coming up. This is our topic for today. We're recording this part of the salon. You can tweet about it, you can share whatever you want on Twitter, you can write a blog post about it, whatever you want. This part is public. Hashtags Tech Salon C19 and COVID-19. The second hour, we're going to drop you into breakout rooms so that you can have a more open, free discussion. That discussion is off the record. So we're trying to replicate these kind of off the record sessions that we used to have when we had in-person salons. And we want to give people that freedom to really have a real discussion, to not feel like they have to represent their organization and they have to carry the organizational line. So we will turn off the recording function at that point so that those will truly be off the record. And we ask that you do not publicize what is said in those rooms. Don't assign it to a name. We use Chatham House rule, which means you can talk about it, talk about what you learned, but don't say who said what, because we want people to feel safe to be able to have real conversations. And another thing that when we go into the second hour, we ask that people don't pitch. We really try to keep salons as a learning space and a sharing space to talk about challenges, possible solutions, that sort of thing. And so we just ask that you don't kind of come in trying to pitch a product or something like that, because that's not really the space for product pitching or that sort of thing. So I am going to end here and just introduce our speakers. Today we have Ellie Hale, who's the Design Hops and Communities Lead at CAST. She's coming to us from London. She also co-organizes the London Tech for Good space. Then we have Kumar, who's working at GitHub, and she's on the social impact team, and she runs the Open Source for Good program. We have Angshuman Sarkar, who's a principal consultant at ThoughtWorks, who's going to talk about some kind of concrete implementation with volunteer initiatives that he's been working on in his job. And then we have Anahi, Ayala, Iacucci, who is a co-founder of the Standby Task Force and a member of the Crisis Mapping community. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about some experiences in kind of standing up volunteer groups. So I think we have a really exciting, really interesting kind of wide range of experiences, wide range of the types of volunteer programs that you might be interested in hearing about. And then a lot of learning about what makes for a good program, what makes for a good volunteer, what makes for a good experience, so that we can try to harmonize really you know, what organizational needs are or what volunteer needs are, so that we can kind of make sure that those experiences, both for organizations or for people who are starting volunteer groups or people who want to volunteer, so that those are quality and maybe even more than quality experiences, so that they're impactful and they actually you know, address the real needs that different communities around the world are facing right now during COVID. So I'm going to hand off now over to Ellie, who's going to kick us off today. And yeah, over to you, Ellie.
Thank you very much. First step, unmute. Thanks for having me and for organizing this space. It's really great to have a space to be sharing all of this important learning and knowledge together. So yeah, really looking forward to the breakout sessions as well. Yeah, just to explain my title a little bit as well, the Design Hops and Communities Lead. Design Hops are a workshop format that we've been developing at my charity CAST, which helps introduce charities to user-centered design and kind of digital tech for good development processes. So that might be a bit of a strange word, bit of random jargon, but that's part of my title. So I just wanted to talk about a few things in this short session. Firstly, thinking about some of the needs that we've seen around the charity sector in the UK, so that when we're thinking about like volunteering, doing skills-based volunteering with established organizations, where we can see what are the kind of key needs that are coming up at the moment in the wake of COVID. Also then kind of looking at a little bit of skills-based volunteering generally, like how to add value and some watch outs and learnings from our experience. Then specifically around digital skills-based volunteering, that's something that, yeah, we've done a little bit of research about, and so have some thoughts on that as well. And then finally, like what's out there and how's it working and how can you get involved? So starting off with the charity needs that we're seeing coming through. So CAST is part of a collective, a sort of collaborative effort called Catalyst in the UK, which is a group of different organizations coming together to really build the digital data and design capacity of the social sector. And one of the things that we've been doing since this crisis started unraveling is trying to build a bit of a synthesis engine of all of the needs that we're seeing coming through from the sector, so that we can understand what sort of support is needed and in what areas. So some of the things that we're seeing coming through kind of tend to fit into three main categories. And I thought it would be just like worth running through these very quickly, so that when you're thinking, if I'm a volunteer, what kinds of stuff am I likely to be needing to help with? You'll have a bit of a better sense of what to expect. So the first category is tech. We've seen a lot of charities saying, okay, now suddenly having to move everything online, but help, this is broken, we need a better XYZ. It could be a CRM, it could be a website, it could be that suddenly the demand is massively increasing and they can't meet that demand. So something along those lines of helping them fix something that's broken. Also, a lot of them are asking, what's the best platform for XYZ, and what are the privacy considerations as well? Initially, there was a lot of interest in remote working tools and video conferencing, but now the questions are a lot more nuanced. There are a lot more questions about how do we avoid things like Zoom bombing, or things like our users' privacy being violated. So it's interesting thinking about some of those considerations around safeguarding as well when we're giving support to charities. Another one is around the need to access basic hardware, so phones and data. And another is kind of around specific tech problems people have. So it could be around keeping volunteers' numbers anonymous, for example, if they're calling clients. The second category is around services. So a lot of organizations are now at the stage where they're thinking, okay, so we've suddenly made this switch to remote working, and we're actually trying to figure out which of our services need to continue and which ones can we kind of deliver in new ways. So they're thinking, what's possible and practical moving some of our face-to-face services online, especially if we're furloughing staff. Like, that's a real challenge. And another is, how can we think more creatively about adapting and providing new services online? How can we reach the most vulnerable people effectively? How can we support our clients on social media and with digital content? And thinking about if they need to develop a service with simple tech or low data use, how might they start doing that? And some are at the stage where they're thinking, well, okay, this is all, we've got a bit of a crisis response planned out here, but in the long term, what should we do next with digital? What should we prioritize? How do we even prioritize? What's that whole process look like? Maybe they're not so familiar with working through some of these things digitally as they would be in a kind of face-to-face or analog setting. And then the third section is around digital ways of working. So that was something that there was initially probably the biggest rush of need around. Slightly less now. I think we've seen a lot of people have incredibly rapidly just got skilled up and got to grips with all these new ways of working that we're getting used to now. So giving staff teams confidence to use things like Zoom and WhatsApp, both to work with each other, but also now as a service delivery tool as well. And the crucial aspect there is around safeguarding and supporting the well-being for both staff and the volunteers and the service users themselves. So that's something that if you're coming in as a volunteer, you might think, I can give the skill support on how to get Zoom up and running, but I might not be so sure on all the safeguarding needs. So it's really important to understand where are the kind of limitations, I guess, of your expertise, and where might you need a little bit of extra help to provide the best value and be able to provide the really kind of the solid advice and support that a charity needs to deliver things safely and effectively. So the next bit I'm going to say about skills-based volunteering, and I'm sure loads of people who've done a lot of this before will have loads of their own experiences that could feed into this. Obviously, there's quite big language and culture differences sometimes between the tech community and social organizations, but just because an organization doesn't use the same language doesn't necessarily mean they don't have that capability or those practices in-house. And I think this is some of the place where misassumptions can actually start to grow. So one of the most important things we found is just building a shared understanding between the two parties and an investment in the mission of the organization, that mutual respect, both having a sense of humility and understanding of each other's domain expertise. So do go in expecting to learn as much as you think you might be teaching. I think that's something that's quite a really rewarding aspect of skills-based volunteering, actually. So another thing that we've seen people slip up on a little bit is having expectations of quite a well-formed onboarding system or an induction. And at the moment, obviously, organizations are super stretched, and even in the best of times, not all of them have a sort of a volunteer management process. Some of them really do, and they're amazing. And you'll get really clear guidance on where to provide help and how you can work with who to do what, but an awful lot don't. And so just have a little a mind to thinking, how might you do some of that work for the organization to understand how they can get the best out of you. Then another aspect of volunteering in general is that there's often a huge desire and will to provide support immediately in these kind of crisis situations. Ooh, that's my message to myself. I've got 1 minute. But actually we found that long-term engagement, things like being a strategic guide on a trustee basis, for example, is so much more effective than kind of these one-off engagements. So if you can, think about how could you actually provide that support on an ongoing basis that can really build that relationship with the organization. I'm going to send a little link to a report that we did around charities and volunteers with digital skills, because there's loads of extra stuff in there, and it's really awesome around how to actually watch out for some of these pitfalls that are quite common. So things like a lot of people expect to be going in to do tech development. Actually, often what's needed is a bit more of a needs assessment or problem identification sprint or piece of work before any actual solutions identification comes in. Similarly, people expect to be going and creating, but maybe a bit more coaching is what's really, really valuable for the organization. And then building capacity instead of dependency, because that's another area we've seen so many times where volunteers go in with the best of intentions and provide great support, but then often don't necessarily pass on the skills or the full understanding of how to maintain or keep running what they've built. And that can actually leave an organization worse off than before the volunteer engagement, which is just really hard to sort of get around, really. So just be mindful of that. And then finally, I'd like to just say, do make massive use of what's out there, because there's so much brilliant resource to help if you're going into volunteer. There's a great handbook called the Coronavirus Tech Handbook. I'm sure some of you have come across that already. It's an enormous great directory of loads of stuff that's going on that you can kind of use as a signposting aid, or actually see who else is working on things already so that you don't have to start from scratch and reinvent the wheel. There's loads of different service patterns out there. We're working on a site of service recipes, which is essentially like a set of different case studies of really well-defined services softwares that some charities have built. And that's something that, again, you can kind of use as a great starting point when you're working with an organization to see what's really working in the sector already. And finally, I'm just going to wrap up by saying, do look out for like other communities that are able to help you find a really good match for your skills, because there's some brilliant skills-based volunteering platforms already that have a lot of that process set up into them, which is helps you avoid some of the pitfalls. We've got a few on our Catalyst program and over at CAST, but there's just so many brilliant Tech for Good communities like this one, where you'll be able to find individuals to figure out like what exactly is their need at the moment, what is their current capability, and how can you kind of best provide that help. There's loads of locally based ones, there's loads of sort of thematically based ones, and just keeping an eye on all the different communities out there, I think is a really good piece of final advice I'd give anyone looking to volunteer. And good luck. Share and learn with each other. That's a bonus piece. Share and learn, because we're all figuring it out and improving. So yeah.
Great. Thanks, Linda. I think I'm going to be able to build off a lot of what Ellie said with her great points. And the first one I'll do is I'm going to embarrass him, but my brother Kieran's on the line. He's a software engineer over at Apple. So I will do my best to take out all of the international development and tech jargon so that we can all come together and understand what we are actually talking about. So my background is actually as a tech for international development practitioner. ICT for D is an acronym I know a lot of people on the line know. So I worked as a UX designer for the UN and in project management and strategy for a long time before coming over to GitHub last year to run a program called Open Source for Good. So I sit on the social impact team, and the way that we kind of approach Open Source for Good as a program is not just to really look at the individual tools that we host on GitHub, because we host obviously millions of them, but to figure out how we can work with what we call the social sector. So Ellie brought this term up as well. So the way we defined it at GitHub is basically any organization, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit, whether they focus on US domestic social good problems or internationally, any social good organization that, or any organization that primarily focuses on social good issues. And so we work with the social sector to figure out how we can make open source more relevant, easier to access, and just more understandable and relatable, because we know a lot of the decision makers in the social sector are not necessarily technologists themselves. Last week, Linda was actually part of a really great panel we had on COVID-19 pandemic responses, and I highly recommend that you check it out if you're interested in how open source kind of intersects with COVID-19. And one of the things that I discussed on that panel was kind of how we're looking at COVID responses at GitHub. So we break it down into basically three major categories. The first one is societal, so basically things like distance learning for the hundreds of millions of children across the world who are now out of traditional classrooms, the tragic and unfortunate situations of increases of domestic violence and abuse and child abuse that are happening because of shelter-in-place orders. And then there's the economic category, which has to do with like international trade, the mass unemployment we're seeing here in the States, and just, you know, market fluctuations around the world. And then last category is pandemic responses. So anything to do with the coronavirus spread, the mortality rate of COVID-19, all of those things that you think of with the public health and medical systems when it comes to COVID-19 and the coronavirus. So those are kind of the three categories that we look at GitHub. And so I think one of the first things I'll say for this talk is just be clear about what you're actually trying to address. I think there's a lot of projects out there that kind of straddle them because they're all interrelated, but at the same time, some people are looking at problem statements that are quite distinct from others, and there's really no separation because everything is COVID all the time. So just to take it back, so when I started at GitHub last year, it was the first time that I had really been on a social impact team, and I'm really proud to say that we do really go deep into the tech, and we really think about how we can activate the platform, the community, and the products that we build in order to better, you know, the situation and how social sector organizations do their work. But it was still a social impact team for a corporate tech company. And so there were some undertones of corporate social responsibility, one of which is being in charge of volunteer programs, which I had never done before. I have a colleague who does do the lion's share of the volunteer work, but, you know, being the kind of the techie on the social impact team, the skills-based volunteering thing kind of came to me. And so what I did was I did a bunch of semi-structured interviews with people within GitHub. We call them hubbers. and just asked how they wanted to interact with the social impact team. And it turned out there was a pretty even split. A lot of people really wanted to do what we call like lower skilled volunteers. So basically volunteering for things that you're not necessarily trained to do. There's a lot of skill that goes into building a house. And if I go and volunteer to build a house, I'm not saying that there's no skill involved, but I am not trained to build a house. So I would consider that low skill volunteering for me. And there's a lot of people at GitHub who wanted to do things like that. They wanted to do things that were just kind of a one-off, help the local community kind of thing. And then there are people who want to use their actual skills, what they got hired at GitHub to do in a volunteer capacity. And so that's kind of how we look at the distinction between low skilled and quote unquote skills-based volunteering. And then there are, of course, people who want to volunteer, and then there are people who are seeking volunteering opportunities, or people who are seeking volunteering opportunities and people who need volunteers themselves. So low skilled versus skills-based, people who need volunteers, people who want to volunteer. So you get 4 kind of distinct categories of people. I'm going to be focusing on the skills-based volunteering part for this talk, both people who want to volunteer and both people who are seeking volunteers. So just a couple of like do's and don'ts that I've seen from my work at GitHub. Okay, so what to do if you want to volunteer? First of all, please recognize this is not the time to build your portfolio. I recognize the fact that there's a lot of students coming out now who are very much in flux with their careers. There's a lot of people who are transitioning because the economy up until 3 months ago was excellent. And so everybody thought this is a great time to take a risk and I'm going to try something new. I understand that. I get that. As somebody who's made a career transition several times, I totally understand where you're coming from. But we are in a crisis mode right now and it's global. So this is not the time to say, I'm going to build a prototype when I've never built a prototype before. My advice to you first and foremost is to stick to what you know how to do best. If you're a great technical documentation person, then please go find a place to volunteer technical documentation skills. Don't go and do something that you really haven't done before. To give you a sense of scale, so GitHub now is tracking about 60,000 projects to do with COVID-19. So there are a lot of opportunities out there, but there are also a lot of duplicates out there. And coming from a program called Open Source for Good, where the whole point is to build in what's already there, to make an ecosystem. On one hand, we see the merit because people just want a place that they can, feel like they're doing something, feel part of a community, and there's a huge impact of that. So I'm not dismissing that. But for the fact that there's a lot of duplicated efforts, I think one point that seems to be missing in a lot of dialogue about volunteerism is that if you volunteer 10 hours of your time, that's not a net gain of 10 hours. There's a lot of work that goes into managing all of the volunteer work that you give, to matching you to correct opportunities, and again, to reducing all these duplication of efforts. And so as frustrating as it can be, if you want to do good volunteering, sometimes you have to do that work on your own. You've got to find the opportunities yourself, and you've got to figure out how you can contribute in a meaningful way that doesn't, again, duplicate all of the 60,000 plus efforts that are there on GitHub alone. Another thing that Ellie mentioned and that I'll reemphasize is that you should always try to build off of what's there. There is a great ecosystem in the Open Source for Good community. Again, you should check out the panel that Linda and I were on last week. There's a whole public health ecosystem that I know a lot of people on this call are aware of, but then people maybe coming from big tech companies are not so. So if you have a specific skill set, like you're very good at programming in a certain language, then there probably is an opportunity. But if you take a little bit extra time to find where those are best placed, then the time that you can offer is much better used. The next point I'll say is, if you're trying to address something, do a bit of research. And this is something that I think a lot of tech for international development practitioners are uniquely good at, is to try to figure out if there is an opportunity that's already there and if you are adding something that may not exist. So for example, again, on our panel last week, Mike Ndale, who is the co-founder of the Africa COVID-19 Response Toolkit, he came to us and said, I know that there's other work that's being done on platforms like DHIS2 and with ComCare, but I'm Ethiopian and I've mobilized this great set of 1,600 volunteers who are also Ethiopian. So we're working directly with the Ministry of Health and we would like to do something for them. So we created this entire toolkit. So while the tech wasn't new, the placement was and the connections were. And that's something that's really adding to the overall, open source for good or just tech for social good ecosystem when it comes to these responses. So just try to figure out if there's something that you're uniquely placed to do. And then lastly, as a designer, as really somebody who just tries to do as much as she can in, evidence-based search, just understand what the problem is that you're trying to address. And this goes back not only to the 3 categories, but just defining a specific problem statement. And this is a telltale issue for all kinds of tech for social good, not just with COVID, but a lot of people are coming out and saying, well, everybody's broke now, or everybody's unemployed, and that's what I wanted to address. That is a really broad set of problems, right? Like, you need to be able to define much more deeply than everybody's broke, and I want to do something. Figure out if there's a certain community that you want to work with. Figure out if there's a certain service that's being underutilized. Figure out if there's a piece of tech that they actually might be able to use better. Figure out if there's a reason why they're being left out of what's already been solutioned so far. The better that you can define your problem statement, the better your initial tech solution will actually be. And then from there, you can grow. But don't start large, start very small, and then see how you can expand out. So those of you who are here because you want to find opportunities, in addition to the COVID-19 Tech Handbook, we work with an organization called OVIO. It's OVIO, and I'll put it in the chat as well. They basically do data scrapes of GitHub, and they have a really clean UI that just basically displays different issues or bugs that need to be triaged, or different tasks that need to be done on open source repos. It's a quick way to find out, if you're a developer, things that you can volunteer in quickly. And then if you join our Open Source for Good listserv, we periodically post some asks as well. And then Catchafire, of course, a lot of people are familiar with the platform, also do quite a bit on skills-based volunteering. Okay, so the third section is what should you do if you're volunteers who are trying to mobilize other volunteers? This is a tough question, obviously, because everybody's going through a lot right now. Kids are at home, people's rentals are in flux, unemployment is affecting 30+ million people in the States alone. So there's a fine line between positive encouragement and pressing people to get involved. At a lot of corporate companies, you have these great programs that try to get like 10% of people involved into a volunteer initiative, but a lot of those have kind of tapered off right now because people just need to figure out their immediate needs before they can figure out if they can volunteer. So I would encourage, if you're trying to mobilize, really go after people who feel that they can. If you need help from GitHub or another tech company, please understand that us volunteering or mobilizing a few volunteers is not a substitute for you doing an entire technology project. We just don't have the capacity to help you scope out a project, build a lo-fi prototype, test the prototype, do a coded prototype, implement, deploy, bug triage, and then help you with the PR and comms around that. That's the entire project. If you get to the point where you feel like you have that kind of work, I feel like it's honestly just not a great ask to come to a tech company and ask us to help you with that specifically, because it's hard for us to know where to start. But if you have something very specific that you need help with, that's a lot easier for us to deal with. We can also help you with specific asks. If you need free products or licenses, if you need a connection to another tech company, in some cases we can help with visibility, and in limited cases we can help with funding. So if you have, in a situation where you're trying to build like a skills-based volunteering program in mass, for instance, reach out to us and see if we can build a partnership before approaching us to do an entire project. And then hopefully, we can either figure out how to help with these initial small tasks, or we can figure out a longer term engagement to build something more meaningful. So those are some of the tips that I have coming from GitHub. Just be clear about the project management support you can offer. Just be clear about the problem statement you're trying to go after, and trying to come to us with as much specific information as you can, because that'll give us a lot more information that we need to figure out how we can properly engage. I'll drop my contact information in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me. I am very good about responding to people, and I will always give you some of my time. So no problem there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having me here. Hi. So my name is Angshuman. I work for ThoughtWorks India, part of our global health team. I'm a technologist, so please excuse me, and also been working in specifically in global health, public health. So my lenses might be more from from open source, as well as like equitable technology for healthcare specifically. I'm going to talk about a few things, most on the software side of things, and absolutely in line with what Ellie and Mala has already talked about. I'm going to probably also share some of our experiences in terms of like, since the time the COVID-19 emerged towards that. So we've been involved with various software solutions or technology solutions for starting from, say, emergency response to, like, say, tomorrow's problem, like capturing clinical test data, to continuously evolving sort of problems like, epidemiological studies and modeling, etc. And I hope, like, through some of these examples that I can bring out that what has worked for us and what has not worked for us as an individual as well as organizations. So first thing I think, like both Mala and Ellie talked about, and I'll put it as a differently, is an alignment. My humble request would be, like, don't reinvent, right? Lots of people are working on tons of different problems. If you can find an alignment, like, chances of your being successful or your effort leading towards a larger cause, like, and having a larger effect, for example, will be higher. We are not in day zero problem, all right? We are, day zero problem are the things like, hey, I need a bunch of guys who can work like, 72 hours nonstop, no sleep, nothing. We have done that as well, right? We are in like, day one, or like, say, day two, that is like, tomorrow's problem as such. So think about it. If you are trying to solve day zero problem, it's probably already there. People are already working on it. If you're working on day one problem, which is today's problem as such, probably there are ideas as well. So figure out, like, whom do you want to associate with? Whom do you want to align? Is it local or is it global, for example, right? And yeah, reutilize your skills, align with your skills. I completely agree that this is not time for your portfolio building, right? Specifically in open source, we are all driven by sort of like passion. We are driven by, like, something that moves us, something that we can relate to, associate with. So keep that, like, but like, as I'm saying, figure out who is working on something locally or broader, like, globally as well, and align that. Because coming together, you want to maximize effort, and you can't solve all these problems as like, together. Like at ThoughtWorks, we have lots of passionate people. It's like 47 different organizations, like, together. Everybody has opinion, everybody wants to contribute. So we ran in terms of how we work coherently, how you don't, like, overdo things, for example. And we didn't get that right till we put, like, and group together who would foresee or figure out all the 47 offices, what people are thinking, what are they doing, right? And only, like, once we had such a action group, we could, like, align ourselves with our effort. Second thing is, like, like everything, like, find an owner in whatever you are working. Is it a fresh idea? I would say, like, is there an owner for it, right? Keep the faith, but at the same time, right, like, find an owner. Is there, whatever you're doing, is somebody going to use it as from day tomorrow? Right? So think about that. Even if it's a larger thing, think about, like, okay, instead of writing, like, code from the day one, day zero, find out, like, who is the prospective, like, user is going to be. And you would find that, like, in this process, you don't get frustrated. And remember, like, that this is not the time, like, or to get dejected. Sure, you're going to get dejected, for example, because, like, whatever you worked for the last 2 weeks or 3 days didn't take off. It has happened with us as well. But then you realized, like, we were working on something like an immunity pass or an electronic pass sort of a thing. Not everything got utilized. The one idea of using the electronic pass didn't even materialize. But what he built as a backend, for example, is now being used in multiple different projects. So it's not that it was all for waste, but lots of people probably, oh, I worked heart and soul onto this. Now I have nothing. Don't get dejected that it is the time to rise up and how we recollect ourselves, regather, and, like, fight together. This is like a war. Sometimes, like, you just need to follow the generals, like, your superiors, like, so keep the faith. From the devs perspective, and I know, like, lots of developers might be there in this call or organizations, remember, you are the last line of defense, right? I think, like, that was said by Robert Martin. But take, like, some of these things like security measures seriously. right? You might not be able to prioritize everything. Security is endless, but do in terms of at least basic security threat modeling and figure out what are the most important things that you must solve right from the day zero, right? And as you know, there are all sorts of tools and technologies coming out, right? It might not be like, you might be working on one part, but whatever you do, make sure you don't take off your security lenses. You are the last line of defense. Don't do another aspect, the fourth thing, don't do anything that is not appropriate technology, right? This is a time when nobody has time to really conventional ways of training, like, support or setting expectations. You need to probably take certain calls. So think about digital principles, not everything design along with the user, but you might not find that, but try to get at least a representative user and work through that. Lastly, think about, I have known nothing but open source in my entire life, right? So I probably find it odd when somebody would not think about something, software that is not open source. And think about, what is open source about? Is it just about code? It's more than that, right? It's about transparency. It's about the truth that is established by the openness and the collaboration, right? So be open to challenge, be open to your ideas. Somebody might challenge your idea. Doesn't mean they're undermining your work. It's just different thoughts and ideas come in, right? There is this Linus's law, right? That given enough eyeballs, what was it? That all bugs are shallow. It's like that. You can have enough eyeballs, your ideas will only get stronger, only will get validated by that many people. And we have gone through all this stuff. Right. For example, sometimes you might have to align with multiple organizations. We did that. We worked on epidemiological studies, with one group. Then you realize, oh, this didn't work out. Now we all figured out somebody else got interested, and universities, we worked along with them, and something great come out from that. Something that is known as now Epirust and open source tooling. So that's all I got to say. Keep the faith, right? Keep working, align with the right initiatives, whichever way, your passion, your local needs as such. Keep your security antennas on, and yeah, don't do anything that is not appropriate tech. Thank you.
So I'm Anahi, and one of the reasons why I'm here is because it was really many years ago. It was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I started to get involved with what at the time were called volunteer technical communities, which were kind of coming out from the Haiti earthquake. And it's kind of I think a lot of you probably do remember that. We're talking about, for example, crisis camps, and then Crisis Commons came out as an organization, and then OpenStreetMap that was very involved in Haiti, also then formed OpenStreetMap Humanitarian. Then there was the Standby Task Force, Humanity Road. It was really kind of a multiplication of organization that came out after Haiti and also during the Chile earthquake and in the year after, that were basically literally just people that would go online and use the skills that they had to try to support organization responding to emergencies. And at the time when we created the Standby Task Force, which is still an ongoing organization, if you go standbytaskforce.com, you'll find it. I'm not involved anymore with the organization, but when we created in 2010, I think, 2010, yes, it was really 7 of us. And what happened was that during the first 6 months, we went from 7 to around 500. And between the beginning of that and a year and a half, we were around 2,000, 3,000 volunteers. And so I think we've learned a lot of things, and I think it was a very, very, very steep learning curve for us. So I thought that maybe some of the things that we've learned in those years could be helpful both for volunteers and for organizations that work with volunteers. So the first one is that we put a lot of weight and a lot of emphasis at the beginning, especially into being able to understand people's skills. And we were literally pairing people by skills. We had teams of translators, we had teams of developers and coders and UX designers and all of that. And we were very keen in making sure that people that had the same skills or people that had the skills required for the job were paired with the right team at the time. And one of the things that we realize is that skills is not enough, and that personalities comes into play a lot. So we could pair the perfect coder with the perfect project or the perfect NGO, and then they were just not being able to work together. And it wasn't because one of the two was wrong, it was simply because the two people could not work together. So we realized that working in, online with people that you've never met, with people that you don't have any interactions with outside of the online world is actually extremely difficult and requires way more human or soft skills, if you want, than the hard skills that we were worried about. The second one, and it's very much related, was that at least in the Standby Task Force, there were people from all over the world. There still are people from all over the world. So we had people that had very high skills. We had people that had very little skills, but could still do a lot of the mechanical work that we required to be done in terms of, like, literally, they weren't coders. They were like a housewife, but she was able to pinpoint things on a map, so she could do that work. And we had people from all sorts of different cultural backgrounds. We had people that spoke very good English, people that spoke very little English. And we realized that a lot of the issues that were coming around in managing volunteers were related to the ability of people to communicate and understand each other. And again, the body language and tone and voice and cultural references are really almost like 80% of how we communicate. So we didn't realize that that was actually extremely important when having large teams of people coming from a lot of different cultures that had to work together and communicate constantly, only using, for example, chat. And the third thing that for me was very important then, and I've seen this already in some of the volunteer groups that are working, for example, on the COVID response, is the fact that we often forget that volunteers, and for COVID is particularly true, volunteers are also people that are affected in the same time. And so there is a massive load, emotional load, and load of your own personal life and your own personal routine and being in quarantine and being locked in the house and all of these things that we sometimes completely forget are also part of managing volunteers. And so for us, it got to the point where we actually had specific people within the organization that were solely dedicated to going to the chat groups and trying to figure out if everybody was okay, monitoring how many hours people were working, and making sure that people were not staying online for more than 8 or 9 hours a day. So for me, those are things that are those are important point for organizations that want to have volunteers, but also for volunteers themselves. Because every single volunteer that I've ever met, the first time you tell them, make sure you check your mental health, will tell you, oh yeah, no problem, I'm totally fine. And I know that everybody that is here that think about volunteering is probably thinking, I'll be totally fine. It's actually not the case. 99% of the people that I've worked with that have volunteered in long-term projects, especially in something that was very emotionally involving, had some repercussion in terms of their ability to manage the emotion and the stress associated with that. And I think I'm just gonna close with a reference to the question that was made, because that was also something that for us was very important. We got to the point where we were very good at what we were doing, and we had teams of technology, kind of like we have our technology team that was software developers that were developing solutions for organizations, large organizations, including the UN or big NGOs. And at a certain point for us was very critical to ask the question of when does the emergency mood stops and when does you need to pay to get this job done starts. Because I think that sometimes, especially NGOs, tend to forget that line and tend to forget that one thing is to set up and work with a group of volunteers that want to help to do certain things. One thing is to think that you take something that you would normally hire a team of developers to create and you shove it to like Slack and give it to a bunch of volunteers and expect them to do the job that you would have otherwise paid for. So we never really managed to solve it as a problem. Like we ended up in several situations asking ourselves, okay, should we really do that as volunteers, or should we say, no, thank you, but here is a bunch of people that you can hire if you want to do it. And I think that it's a very important question to keep in mind, even as a volunteer yourself, because there must be a limit in between what you're willing to volunteer in terms of your skills and when that line is crossed and you actually, it's good to ask I should be compensated for this because this is actually a job. And I think I'm gonna kind of like just wrap it up here.